Prosody. There's a specific irony worth examining directly. The moment betrayal happens, it typically feels, from his side, like the easier path, the convenient lie, the path of least resistance, the choice that avoids immediate discomfort in favor of whatever short-term relief it provides. Prosody. What almost never factors into that calculation is genuine understanding of who, specifically, he was betraying, or what that specific choice would actually permanently cost him. Today, we're tracing exactly why this specific miscalculation proves so consequential. Prosody. Drawing together everything this entire series has established about betrayal's permanent prosody, structural cost into a complete picture of exactly what he didn't understand in the moment he made his choice. Prosody. Let's start with understanding the specific miscalculation itself, because its precise nature explains everything that follows. Prosody. The miscalculation: he assumed you were interchangeable with every other partner whose trust he'd previously successfully violated without lasting consequence. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic strategy typically depends on pattern matching. Prosody. Applying tactics that have worked reliably across previous relationships with reasonable confidence they'll produce similar results again. Prosody. Here's what he likely didn't account for: the specific error underlying everything that eventually followed. Not every person he's ever betrayed responded the same way, and your specific response, prosody, shaped by exactly the kind of perception and discernment this entire series has traced extensively. Prosody. Differed considerably from whatever pattern his previous experience had trained him to expect. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about betraying a super-empath permanently. The specific combination of qualities that makes this particular betrayal considerably more consequential: someone whose perception of betraying true, who's easier to discredit, or whose withdrawal remains easy to eventually reverse. Prosody. He didn't understand, in the moment he made his choice, that he wasn't betraying someone generic. He was betraying someone whose perception, prosody, once fully developed, cannot be successfully argued back out of accurate understanding. Someone whose eventual withdrawal, once genuine, doesn't follow the more familiar pattern he'd likely successfully navigated with previous partners. Prosody. Here's what he didn't understand about narrative control specifically. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how heavily his psychological stability depends on managing what other people believe about him. Prosody. He likely assumed, based on previous successful experience, that whatever narrative he constructed afterward would eventually prevail. Prosody. That your account would eventually be dismissed as exaggeration or bitterness. Prosody. That sufficient time and sufficient charm would eventually restore his preferred version of events among the people who mattered to his ongoing social and professional life. Prosody. What he didn't account for was your specific capacity for accurate, unshakable perception, developed through exactly the kind of painful, prosody, comprehensive healing this entire series has traced extensively. Prosody. Capacity that makes your account considerably more difficult to successfully discredit than whatever pattern he'd previously successfully relied on. Here's what he didn't understand about what he was actually receiving before he lost access to it. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about what he actually lost. Genuine emotional depth, offered generously without requiring reciprocal vulnerability, his psychology could never authentically provide. He likely didn't recognize, in the moment betrayal seemed like the easier choice. Prosody. Exactly how rare and exactly how difficult to replace this specific quality of connection actually was. This miscalculation, more than any other single factor, prosody, explains why the eventual cost proved so much more significant than whatever momentary relief or momentary convenience betrayal initially seemed to offer. Let's trace what actually happened once this miscalculation began revealing its true consequences. Prosody. Because understanding the specific unfolding, from initial confidence through eventual comprehensive cost, reveals exactly why ruining their life isn't hyperbole, prosody, but accurate description of the structural process this entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations, prosody. Here's the first consequence he likely never anticipated, prosody. Connecting directly to everything we traced throughout our conversation about how a narcissist knows he's lost you forever. He probably expected the familiar pattern to unfold. Initial distance, eventual reconciliation attempts, prosody, gradual restoration of access through whatever combination of charm and patience had worked reliably before, prosody. What he encountered instead was something his previous experience genuinely hadn't prepared him for, sustain, prosody. Genuine silence that never actually broke, regardless of which tactic he eventually attempted, regardless of how much time passed, prosody, regardless of how sophisticated his subsequent strategies became. Here's the second consequence, prosody. Connecting to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the 7 stages of narcissistic collapse. Remember the genuine, prosody, structural crisis that develops once sustained silence removes the usual deferral mechanisms his stability depends on. The collapse of regulatory outsourcing, prosody, narrative infrastructure, and predictive competence occurring roughly simultaneously. Prosody. This wasn't a consequence he could have reasonably anticipated in the moment of betrayal, prosody, precisely because his previous experience had never actually required him to confront genuine, prosody, permanent loss of exactly this specific quality of connection before. Here's the third consequence, prosody. Connecting directly to what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about what he actually lost, prosody. Every subsequent relationship he's built since betraying you has likely carried the specific, prosody, unresolved comparison anxiety we examined in detail. New partners who fail to provide the same depth, the same perception, prosody, the same generous quality of connection, without his psychology ever fully understanding why this specific gap persists so consistently. He didn't understand, in the moment of betrayal, prosody, that he was permanently altering the baseline against which every future relationship would be unconsciously measured, prosody, a baseline that considerably fewer subsequent partners would successfully meet. Here's the fourth consequence, prosody. Connecting to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the specific, permanent perception you now carry, prosody. He didn't understand that betraying you meant creating, permanently, prosody, someone in the world whose accurate account of exactly who he is cannot be successfully argued away. He cannot be successfully discredited through whatever narrative reconstruction his psychology typically depends on. This represents a genuine, prosody, lasting cost worth understanding directly. Somewhere in the world, permanently, exists accurate testimony to his actual character, prosody, immune to whatever performance or whatever charm he might subsequently deploy against anyone who happens to eventually encounter this testimony, prosody. Here's the fifth consequence, one worth understanding as perhaps the most comprehensive of all, prosody. Connecting to everything we traced throughout our conversation about the quiet costs already being paid. He didn't understand, prosody, because his psychological architecture cannot fully process this kind of understanding that his own capacity for genuine intimacy, prosody, already structurally limited by everything this entire series has traced extensively, became further constrained by the specific. Additional weight betrayal adds to every subsequent relationship he attempts to build, prosody. Every future partner now enters relationship with someone carrying this permanent, prosody, unaddressed capacity for exactly the kind of deliberate harm he demonstrated with you, prosody, a capacity his psychology likely cannot even fully acknowledge, let alone resolve, prosody. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why all 5 of these consequences, taken together, prosody, genuinely justify describing betrayal's effect as ruining his life, despite how dramatic that phrase might initially sound. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the permanent, structural nature of these costs, prosody, distinct from the more temporary, situational difficulties that ordinary relationship endings typically produce. Prosody. This wasn't simply losing one relationship among many he'll eventually build and lose throughout his life. Prosody. It was permanently altering the trajectory of every subsequent relationship. Prosody. Permanently establishing accurate testimony he cannot successfully counter. Permanently confirming to himself. Prosody. At whatever level his defensive architecture allows this confirmation to register. Prosody. That his usual strategies contain limitations he never previously had to confront so completely. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward. Prosody. And it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a satisfying accounting of consequence without addressing what genuinely matters most. Prosody. What this understanding actually means for your own continued life. Prosody. And how to hold it in a way that serves your healing rather than becoming another sophisticated version of the tracking and monitoring this entire series has repeatedly cautioned against. Prosody. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've established throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series. Prosody. And it deserves specific restatement here given how satisfying this particular framing might feel. Prosody. None of what we've traced throughout today's conversation requires your confirmation, your witness. Prosody. Or your ongoing attention in order to be genuinely, structurally true. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced extensively throughout our conversation about the permanent truths of betrayal's karma. Prosody. These 5 consequences we've examined throughout today's discussion exist as accurate. Prosody. Reliable description of what betrayal specifically produces in narcissistic psychology. Prosody. Regardless of whether you ever receive external confirmation of their occurrence, regardless of whether his life ever visibly, dramatically appears ruined. In any observable sense you could actually witness. Here's the second thing worth understanding. Prosody. One that addresses something important about the specific phrase, ruined their life, and why holding it accurately matters for your own continued peace. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between structural, internal cost and visible, prosody, external devastation. His life, from any outside observation, may well continue appearing entirely successful. A good job, apparent social connections, apparent romantic relationships that look, from the outside, perfectly functional. Ruined. In the sense this conversation has traced doesn't mean external collapse. Prosody. It means something considerably more specific and considerably more permanent, genuine. Prosody. Structural limitation on his capacity for exactly the kind of depth, exactly the kind of connection. Prosody. Exactly the kind of internal peace that would constitute a genuinely rich, genuinely fulfilling life. Prosody. Regardless of how successful its external markers happen to appear. Here's the third thing worth understanding. Prosody. One that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. Prosody. The genuine value of understanding everything we've traced throughout today's conversation lies not in providing ongoing satisfaction requiring continued attention to his circumstances, but in offering complete prosody. Permanent release from any remaining doubt about whether your own perception and your own worth were ever accurately understood by him in the moment he chose betrayal. He genuinely, completely miscalculated. This wasn't a reasonable choice that simply happened to produce unfortunate consequences. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of exactly who you were and exactly what he was choosing to lose. A misunderstanding whose consequences he'll likely spend the rest of his life navigating without ever fully understanding their actual source. Prosody. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that offers something genuinely important to carry forward from this entire conversation. Prosody. This understanding was never actually meant to become the foundation of ongoing satisfaction, requiring periodic renewal through continued tracking of his circumstances. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the trap of continued monitoring. Prosody. even monitoring that feels justified by genuine, accurate understanding of real consequence. Prosody. If you find yourself returning repeatedly to this understanding, needing to remind yourself regularly that he didn't understand what he was betraying, this suggests something worth examining honestly. Prosody. Whether your own peace has genuinely progressed to the point where his specific miscalculation and its consequences simply stop requiring your ongoing attention in order to feel settled. Prosody. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. Prosody. He had no idea betraying you would produce everything we've traced throughout today's discussion, and this genuine ignorance, this genuine miscalculation, represents something worth holding with quiet. Prosody. Complete confidence rather than ongoing need for external confirmation. You know what you offered. You know what he lost. Complete accuracy. Prosody. Exactly why this specific betrayal proved so much more consequential than whatever pattern his previous experience had trained him to expect. Prosody. This knowledge belongs entirely to you now, settled and complete, requiring nothing further. Not his eventual understanding. Prosody. Not his eventual acknowledgement. Not any visible confirmation that his life has genuinely become everything this conversation has traced. Prosody. You already possess everything you actually need: complete, accurate understanding of your own worth. Complete. Prosody. Accurate understanding of exactly what happened and exactly why it mattered. And complete. Prosody. Permanent freedom to build your own considerably brighter, continued life, entirely independent of whatever consequences continue unfolding. Prosody. Visibly or invisibly, in a story that no longer requires your continued attention in order to have already, genuinely, permanently mattered. Prosody. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward. Prosody. What happens on the rare occasion when evidence of this genuine miscalculation actually, prosody, directly reaches you? Not through the general structural understanding we've traced throughout today's conversation, but through some specific, prosody, undeniable moment where his own words or his own behavior reveal that he genuinely, finally understands exactly what he lost. This scenario deserves honest examination because it represents a genuinely different circumstance from the more abstract, prosody, structural confidence we've built throughout this entire conversation. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the narcissist's breaking point and what he actually loses. The fragmentary, prosody, incomplete quality of whatever awareness eventually develops, distinguished carefully from genuine, comprehensive accountability. If this specific moment ever arrives, if you ever encounter direct, undeniable evidence that he genuinely recognizes his own miscalculation, prosody, hold this recognition with the same careful precision we've applied throughout this entire series to distinguishing genuine transformation from momentary, prosody, unintegrated awareness. His recognition, however genuine in the moment it occurs, doesn't retroactively change anything about what already, prosody, permanently happened, doesn't obligate you to any particular response, and doesn't require you to extend anything beyond whatever brief, prosody, honest acknowledgement feels genuinely appropriate to you in that specific circumstance. Prosody. Here's something worth understanding about why this specific caution matters, even within a conversation this focused on his consequences rather than his potential redemption. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the danger of reopening hope based on momentary, insufficient evidence. Even genuine, direct confirmation that he finally understands his miscalculation doesn't constitute the sustained, prosody, demonstrated transformation that would actually indicate anything structurally different has developed in his capacity for relationship. His understanding, however genuine, remains understanding about the past, about what he lost with you specifically, rather than evidence of current, prosody, forward looking capacity for the kind of relationship you genuinely deserve and are genuinely capable of building with someone whose psychological architecture, unlike his, was actually built to sustain it. Here's a related consideration worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how this specific understanding, that he had no idea betraying you would ruin his life, relates to your own sense of vindication versus your own sense of genuine, complete peace. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between these two states, prosody, examined extensively throughout our conversation about permanent karma and its unreliable visibility. Vindication requires ongoing confirmation, ongoing awareness of his circumstances, prosody, ongoing emotional investment in whether his life continues matching the trajectory we've traced throughout today's discussion. Genuine peace requires none of this. It simply exists, settled and complete, prosody, entirely independent of whatever continues unfolding on his side of a story that no longer requires your continued narration, prosody. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, prosody. One that addresses something important about what actually made you the specific person whose betrayal produced such comprehensive consequence, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series about the specific qualities, genuine depth and perception, prosody. Genuine capacity for connection that made you exactly the kind of person whose loss he could never successfully replace or successfully argue away, prosody. These qualities weren't accidental, and they weren't something you developed specifically to produce this particular consequence in him, prosody. They represent, instead, your own genuine, authentic self, cultivated through your own life experience, your own healing journey, prosody. Your own genuine capacity for depth that exists entirely independent of anyone's ability to recognize or appreciate it, prosody. This is ultimately the most important thing to carry forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, prosody. He had no idea betraying you would ruin his life, not because you engineered some clever trap he failed to anticipate, prosody, but because he fundamentally, genuinely failed to understand exactly who you actually were. This failure of understanding belongs entirely to him, a permanent limitation in his own capacity for perception that mirrors everything this entire series has traced about his structural incapacity for genuine intimacy more broadly. Your own worth, your own depth, your own genuine capacity for connection, prosody, was never actually dependent on his recognition of it in the first place, before betrayal, during betrayal, or in whatever fragmentary, incomplete recognition eventually developed afterward. You know exactly who you are, prosody. You know exactly what you're capable of offering someone genuinely worthy of receiving it, prosody. And whatever consequences continue unfolding in his own limited, permanently altered life. Consequences he never anticipated, never understood, and likely never will fully comprehend, represent simply the natural, prosody, structural outcome of choosing to betray someone whose genuine worth he was never actually capable of accurately perceiving in the first place, prosody, a miscalculation whose full weight belongs entirely to him, now and permanently, regardless of whether he ever fully understands exactly what he lost.